Okay, so what I'm going to do here, guys, is really give you the first half of our second engagement with the genocide of Rwanda, leaving for our makeup session just a discussion about how Gorovich discusses the events and his really often very poignant and quite meaningful insights into what this event means for international society and well, fundamentally the human condition, I would argue. So in this presentation, I'm going to just a quick recap of the basic elements of the historical backdrop, keeping in mind that I'm one who does not always think that one can meaningfully connect the colonial period in an overly deterministic way to events in a ever receding futures past. But this is one of those cases where I just simply cannot envision the genocide taking place at all without an appreciation for what the Belgians put in place. So then I'll just kind of do a kind of mini conflict analysis. I want us to have a kind of basic sense of who the principal parties to the conflict are, and what some of the principal dynamics of the genocide were, and we'll give you some testimony to give you kind of the survivor's perspective to make it hopefully a bit real, and then conclude with some of the questions that this raises for justice and intervention and things like that. So, okay. So just again, just to recap what I think the consensus view is on the impact of Belgian colonialism, it was in effect to racialize the divide between Hutu and Tutsi, which, as I pointed out in our first session, really can't meaningfully be said to constitute even an ethnic divide, given the way we think of and tend to define ethnicity in terms of language and diet and history and culture and all those things. All those things are shared between or among the Hutu and the Tutsi. So what we really have to appreciate is that the Belgians took a division, a social hierarchy, but one that was fluid and with the capacity for movement across the divide, and made it something very, very different. So we want to think about or recall the important work of the colonial missionaries, specifically their hammering away at the Hamitic hypothesis or the Hamitic myth, which was their way of making sense of what they could not make sense of, the fact that there was, when they arrived, an already existing elaborate state in place, remembering that the Rwandan state emerged in the 15th century, long before the missionaries first arrived. So for them to kind of get their head around things, given their ethnocentrism and racism, they came up with the Hamitic myth, or the Hamitic hypothesis, that those who had created, the Tutsis had created and were ruling the Rwandan state were not in fact African. They were that lost tribe of Ham, or descendants of the lost tribe of Ham. So we're creating with the Hamitic myth we're laying the groundwork for a long-term ideological formation that posits the Tutsi as not being of this place, as an alien people. and that enters or will eventually, over time, constitute a notion of race, that the Tutsis represent an alien race. So we have the colonial missionary work with the Hamitic myth, primarily. We have colonial anthropology, anthropology and anthropological science very much in the business of supporting the colonial enterprise. We talked about phrenology, the kind of bogus science of measuring cranial size and those kinds of things. All this to sort of give a patina of legitimacy to the socio-biological racism of the colonial enterprise. So, and there's a reason today, even actually, that many anthropologists, many Western anthropologists that do work in Africa tend not to refer to themselves as anthropologists because of the very, very bad reputation, the very bad memories of the contributions of anthropology to Africa. So you'll often hear them refer to themselves or each other as sociologists rather than anthropologists because there's just such baggage. But again, it's the use of that kind of, well, it was at the time real science, but quite a deeply flawed one. And then colonial administration, kind of following and with its grounding in the anthropological, quote, knowledge that is being constructed, we have race policy and population control that make the ideas and the ideology of colonial anthropology and colonial missionary notions actual concrete colonial administrative policy. And we talked about the taking of a census, and then the labeling of people as one group or the other, and making that a permanent status rather than something that was prior to that period fluid and subject to change, and it loses those qualities after the Belgian colonial administrators pursue these policies of race and population control. So just to kind of give you the imagery that I think captures what happened, we've got this image of Livingston and Stanley, the first to head up the Congo River, and that captures the era of the missionary discovering the Rwandan state, not being able to understand it, and then therefore articulating the Hamitic myth as a way to get their heads around things they couldn't quite understand. And then we've got the all these images of colonial anthropological science. This is phrenology you're seeing in picture form. Using calipers to measure noses and cranial size. Just complete bogus science. But at the time, it was something of some repute. And then the real policy choices that make what is in development here ultimately so deadly. It's the establishment of through the census taking and the issuance of identity cards, the permanent identification of people as one category or the other. And in this case, we have an identity card issued by the colonial state that this person is, in fact, Tutsi. And what that means is there is no possibility of Gujabira. There's no chance that person can ever be kind of slide down the scale to the status of Hutu, and anyone with a Hutu card would certainly never have the opportunity to go through the process we talked about, the kwihutura, the shedding of one's Hutuness. Those things are gone. That fluidity, that permeability, the porous membrane, if you will, between that constituted the fluid boundaries of Hutu, that's all gone. That identity card with the identity label, or the ethnic label, stays in place until post-genocide. It is the post-genocidal government of Paul Kagame that effectively bans really any discussion, any public narratives that involve or turn on ethnicity in a quite authoritarian way. I mean, we can kind of appreciate what their interests are, but if we have some chance when we have our makeup session, I think it's important that we raise some questions about Paul Kagame that are quite important. So all this had the effect, I hope I made clear, of hardening the formerly very fluid Hutu-Tutsi relations that were, yes, they were hierarchical. I in no way want to, idealize some nirvana of the past. It was a hierarchical relationship, but it was, identities of power and status, not ethnic and certainly not racial. But by creating these permanent identities, or by forging a permanence to formerly fluid, malleable, changeable identities, and then hardening the boundaries between them, and then also, of course, privileging one of those identities, the one that had already been in power, but privileging the Tutsi, and of course, no choice but to privilege the Tutsi, because in their view, in the colonial imagination, they weren't really African after all. They were that displaced, lost tribe of Ham. So they privileged the Tutsi over the Hutu in ways that far exceed anything that the Tutsis, enjoyed prior to the colonial period. There were chieftaincies that Hutus occupied, and all those are stripped from Hutus and placed solely, uniquely into the hands of the Tutsis. And they become, if you remember my discussion of Mamdani's notion of a decentralized despot, they become the native authorities that ultimately rule, and rule rather brutally at times, or in many cases, on behalf of Belgium. They become the decentralized despots. And in doing so, then, what Belgium has done is created a conflict cleavage between Hutu and Tutsi that was vast. It was, and vast in terms of, it's not even, as I said, they didn't constitute a meaningful case for ethnic difference, but what the Belgians have created is a racial divide. So it's a conflict cleavage that is vast. It is now permanent, thanks to the identity cards and things like that. And then ultimately, because they so massively privileged the Tutsi and so intensely subjugated the Hutu to Tutsi power, what they did is, when the victims would later become revenge-seeking killers, they had created identities that were, well, genocidal. So questions for international society, the international reaction, global bystanders to genocide. Let's take us through the events and as they unfold, and let's hear from those who survived and hear their testimony, and then engage with questions when we convene about what could have been done, what intervention might have been appropriate or helpful, keeping in mind, the ethical questions that Singer poses. Do we have obligations to save Tutsis from this death machine? So conflict analysis, right? So the principal conflict part. I just want to kind of give you the catalog, if you will. We want to appreciate, the key players. So we have the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF. That's headed by the commander, Paul Kagame, who has remained president of Rwanda ever since the genocide came to an end. And it came to an end thanks to the victory of the RPF over the armed forces of Rwanda. Paul Kagame has managed to remain president thanks to changes in the Constitution and increasingly brutal, murderous, dictatorial processes. Although one cannot ignore the quite significant, remarkable successes that Kagame has presided over in terms of economic recovery and development, and we're talking, China levels of economic growth sustained since the absolute utter destruction of the Rwandan state. We have the armed forces of Rwanda, the French acronym FAR, Forces Armées Rwandaises, that we'll see kind of in some mapping. There is this backdrop of a civil war, and I want to make clear that there is a very, very important distinction to be drawn between the civil war launched by the RPF when they invade, that is one thing, and then there's the genocide perpetrated against the civilian Tutsi population as a very separate thing. The reason that's important to do is the Clinton administration was using the Civil War, as some even contemporary observers still try to do, to conflate the Civil War between the RPF and the FAR with the genocide, thus enabling non-intervention, to enable bystanding by saying, hey, it's a civil war, we don't want to intervene, and that will have ramifications for the peacekeeping forces, we'll see. We have the French acronym MRND, Mouvement Rwandais National Démocratique, which is the kind of authoritarian one-party system that's the dominant party. But it also has not just its kind of political party apparatus, but it has a militia that is, one of the key participants of the genocide. We can kind of put the MRND into a kind of large circle that encapsulates Hutu extremists of various sorts, or operating in various venues. So we have Radio Television Libre de Mille Collines, the hate radio, using hate radio for months and months and months prior to the genocide to create the conditions, create that existential fear that I've talked about, that has to be present if genocide is to take place. The Akazu, the clan of Madame, the wife of President Juvenal Habyarimana, who was the real power behind the throne. Remember, she had the pedigree, she had the real status and name in Rwandan culture that her husband, the president, did not. And then there's this expression, Hutu power, which is kind of a catch-all phrase to refer to, the genocidal party, as I talked about in the very first session of the course, right? That whether it's Carthage or what have you, there's always Nazis. There's always a kind of an identifiable genocidal party, and Hutu power can be a reference or a way to kind of refer to the genocidal party in all of its manifestations. So Hutu extremism. We have France, right, who we'll see has a very, very questionable role to play, but it definitely inserts itself into the Civil War and into the genocide in ways that are quite significant. The Interahamwe is perhaps the militia most known to people. Interahamwe is Banyarwanda for those who work or those who fight together. This is the most notable of the private militias. When we talked about the Dallaire facts, when the informant that came to him to kind of confess that he had been training people, he was training Interahamwe. He was training these private youth to kill 1,000 Tutsi an hour. And these are they constitute sort of the most grim and viciously violent imagery of the genocide. We also have the Tutsi civilians, and I'll just go ahead and put it, and UNAMIR, the UN force. I have these with asterisks because in kind of strict conflict analysis terms, we wouldn't want to put the civilian Tutsi population as a party to the conflict. The Tutsi civilians are the targets of a genocidal program. They are not associated with the RPF, who are actively engaged in an armed conflict. The reason I have them here is they are the victims, obviously, of the genocidal efforts on the part of the genocidal party of Hutu power. But I have them here in terms of parties to the conflict because the abuse or misuse of the Civil War backdrop as a way to conflate genocide with the war background, and therefore as a basis for facilitating bystanding, is something that posits or represents Tutsis, innocent, unarmed civilian Tutsis, as parties to a conflict, which is much like in the context of the Holocaust, for example, that would be having, representing Jews as, a conflict party, who therefore bear some responsibility for the outcome of the Holocaust, and no more than the Tutsi civilians bear responsibility for the genocide perpetrated against them. And then UNAMIR, the UN force there, the peacekeeping force, also not, certainly by strict standards, not a party to the conflict. It's only there, frankly, because of the peace accord that was signed, the Arusha Accord that we talked about last week, that constituted really the death warrant for President Habyarimana. But I have them listed here because they obviously get drawn into the conflict in some pretty awful ways. And one cannot really grapple with the way that the genocide gets prosecuted without an appreciation for what it is that UNAMIR does and cannot do and does not do, because it's not allowed to, or doesn't very quickly have the capacity to act. But so it makes it, in some sense, a party to the conflict in the sense that we need to understand its role if we're to have a full picture of how things happen the way they happened. So the next element of conflict analysis is conflict context. We've given the historical stuff, but I want to give you the kind of regional and contemporary context. So we have, remember, from independence in 1959-60, a series of pogroms. Gurovich's interviews with Tutsi survivors talk about how they mark their calendars. The Tutsis mark their calendars in years of these slaughters, pogroms that the Hutus launched against Tutsis at various periods. In 59, the Social Revolution in 1959, and again in 61, and then early 70s, 71, 73. And each one of those, right, drives more and more Tutsis northward into Uganda, some into the Democratic Republic of Congo, which at the time was called Zaire. But mostly they head north to Uganda, where we talked about last week. The hope was that they would eventually find a home in Ugandan society, but they are denied that. And once they come to the realization that they are never going to find a place of home in Uganda, the now well-trained Tutsis, because they participated in the rebel movement to overthrow the government of Uganda and install its still current president, Museveni, they're now well-armed, well-trained, and led by Paul Kagame. They invade in 1990, and that is the launch of the Civil War. And it's important to sort of get this down, right? There is this Civil War that is launched that begins in 1990 with the invasion by the RPF. These Tutsis that had been, some for 2 generations from the 1960s, are now setting sights on Kigali. They realize, or they've come to the belief, that there is no future for the Tutsis unless they can find a place in Rwandan society and in Rwandan political society, and that will require an invasion and a reconstitution of the Rwandan regime that will guarantee them political rights that they've not had since independence. So the Civil War is launched in 1990, and the RPF, being so well trained, being so experienced in recent combat, just plows through the defending armed forces of Rwanda, and would have taken the capital of Kigali within, say, 6 months, had not France, in support of its puppet regime, per the terms of France Afrique, intervenes and stops the RPF in its tracks and effectively creates a stalemate, stalls the RPF right up there in the kind of the northeast. They can't advance. They can't. But France isn't going to openly oust the RPF from Rwanda. So it just becomes this kind of stalemate, and it's in that context of that stalemate that the Arusha Accord is elaborated, and the president of Rwanda is forced to sign. And it is, as we said, the signing of the 1993 Arusha Accord that constitutes the death warrant, essentially, for President Juvenal Habyarimana, because it will then be about 9 months or so, on April 6th, the shooting down of his plane, and which marks the beginning of the genocide. So that gives us the kind of parties and the now the contemporary context. What about the kind of principal key dynamics of the way the horrors of genocide unfolded? So the first move, really, once the plane is downed, and that first night of violence against Hutu moderates, including the prime minister, and key major players in Rwandan politics are taken out of the scene. Within the first couple of days, one of the first moves is the murder, the massacre of a squad of Belgian peacekeepers. I think it was about 13 of them that were just taken, disarmed. The Belgians did not defend themselves because of the terms of the peacekeeping operation, didn't allow them to, and they were taken away and slaughtered most brutally, intentionally, because they wanted the remains, the physical remains of the tortured, brutalized bodies, to send a message to Belgium, and Belgium received it loud and clear. This was the lesson, many say, that was learned from Somalia. The Somalia intervention by first George Herbert Walker Bush, but then inherited by Clinton, was actually in many respects quite a success in terms of preventing famine from taking the lives of perhaps 250,000 that were quite likely poised to die. But when we have the Battle of Mogadishu and the killing of the 18 Rangers, and particularly the dragging of 1 or 2 American dead soldiers through the streets of Mogadishu, it was just the cause of so much intense outrage among Americans. For many, they just didn't understand. We were there to help them. Why do they hate us? And we might have time, if you're interested. There's some very important answers to those questions that Americans still don't appreciate. Some very bad choices were made under the Clinton period of the control of the operation about how to and with what instruments hunt down a key problem warlord, Muhammad Aidid. But we can go into that. At any rate, the lesson here was, when the Battle of Mogadishu happened and Americans saw dead American soldiers on a mission of humanitarianism, Clinton got the pressure very clear, and he withdrew American forces just precipitously. The Hutu power understood correctly that if they pulled that off, if they did essentially a Battle of Mogadishu thing, they would achieve the withdrawal of the forces that were there, and that's exactly what happened. General Dallaire, Romeo Dallaire, Canadian commander of the UNAMIR, the peacekeeping force there, requests in response to the murder of his Belgian troops an increase in the size of UNAMIR by 5,000. He has known, remember he sent the facts back in January, he's known, as many others have, that this was coming. So he sends again a request for additional 5,000 troops. Now he's got a basis to say, look, we are under threat here. We need to strengthen our force posture, and so requests an additional 5,000 troops. The response is, per the lesson of Somalia, Belgium orders the immediate removal of all of its members of UNAMIR. So all the Belgian soldiers in the UNAMIR force are immediately withdrawn. Belgium then effectively secures the assistance of the United States to cover this action, and we can talk about how that happens, but basically the U.S. makes it easier and possible and feasible to get them out of the picture. The Department of Peacekeeping Operations essentially draws down UNAMIR from its previous force of, I think they were about 25 to 5,000, down to mere 200, and just a mere administrative skeleton crew of 250 soldiers total. And you can obviously see that there's not a significant role to play for UNAMIR in the events to come, but it is precisely the presence of any UN force that will give some Tutsis hope that will lead them to their doom, and we can kind of talk about that. Foreign nationals are immediately evacuated, so the Belgians, the French, the Americans, all of these people are taken away to safety, leaving behind anyone that's Rwandan national, whether they're targeted or not. Okay, so now it's been my experience that these don't play well. But we'll try.
Nitwa Muhinyuza Claire Alphonsine, mfite imyaka 30. Navukiye ku Kibuye muri komine Gitesi. Ndi umupfakazi. Mfite umubyeyi umwe ariko tutigeze tubana. Mama yitwa Bernadette Kanyange, bari 9 ariko hasigaye 2, hasigaye umukobwa n'umuhungu. Umugabo twashakanye yitwaga Mutazana Leonard, bombi bitabye Imana, bose bitabye Imana muri Genocide. Twari dutuye ku Kacyiru munsi ya ministeri, nyuma tuza kuhavanwa nuko ibibazo by'interahamwe byari bikomeye mu 1993, turahunga duhungira ku Muhima. Genocide yabaye dutuye ku Muhima. Umugabo twabanaga yari umutekinisiye kuri Radio Rwanda. Ngewe nari umuntu ucuruza ibintu bisanzwe byoroheje by'ubuconco. Ubwo Genocide itangiye twarahungiye mu Muhima, nibwo Genocide yatangiye we yaragiye gukora Ikibungo. Abiyo ngiyo Genocide itangira tutari kumwe, turindira ko azaza turaheba, ariko ubwo natwe niko bari batumereye nabi, buri munsi batujyana kutwica, buri munsi ntidupfe. Ubwo intambara yakomeye yatangiye mu matariki 11 batangira kwica abantu duturanye, kuko mu Muhima batangiye kwica abantu kuri 11. Ariko ubwo nari narakubiswe, naragiriwe nabi bihagije, naranyoye amaraso y'abapfuye, naragize gute kose. N'icyo gihe nibwo nanjye banjyanye kunyica, banyicana n'umwana umwe w'umuhungu w'umukobwa yaguye iwabo wa se. Baratujyana badushyira mu mwobo tureba turi bazima, barangije bateramo grenade. Ubwo hari ku itariki 6 z'ukwa gatanu bashyiramo grenade. Bamaze gushyiramo grenade duta ubwenge, tubiyongiye sinamenye n'ibyo ari byo. Nyuma ubwo yo kuntera grenade sinasobanukiwe ibyabaye, ahubwo gusa naje kumva, kuko umwobo bari badushyizemo wari uri iruhande rw'inzira. Nyuma nza kumva umuntu atambuka, ni nk'ibintu byaje mu nzozi. Numva umuntu atambuka, numvise umuntu atambuka, mpita mpamagara kuko numvaga ndi muzima. Mpamagaye, wa muntu araza ahagarara hafi y'umwobo, arambwira ati ntugume gusakuza, kuko nuguma gusakuza n'ubundi baraza bakwica. Ceceka, nihaza kuba ku mugoroba ndagaruka nkuvugishe n'ubu ukiri mu mwuka. Ndaceceka mbaho. Ubwo sinarinzi ngo ni ryari, sinarinzi ngo ni isaha yihe, sinarinzi ngo mu mwobo mazemo iminsi ngahe, ariko numvise amvugishije, numva ubwenge butangiye kugaruka. Numva ntekereje ko nkiri umuntu, numva ntekereje ko ntangiye kwibuka ukuntu batujyanye bakadushyira mu mwobo, ntangira kwibuka amagambo bavugiye ku uwo mwobo, ariko nakora mu mutwe w'umwana nkumva umutwe wamenetse. Nkatekereza ko ubanza atari we, ngashakisha, kandi mu uwo mwobo hari harimo n'izindi ntumbi bagiye batemagura barundamo. Nuko ubwo nibwo wa muntu yaje kugaruka ku mugoroba. Aje ahageze arampamagara, aturacyumva, nti atese wakomeretse hehe? Ni sinzi ahariho, ariko ibyo byose nakomeretse, ni kuko ndahaguruka nkumva ntibinkundira, ndajya guhagarara nkumva ntibyemera. Ati reba niba utakomeretse amaguru, ati kuko wakomeretse amaguru ntaho nabasha kukujyana, ati ahubwo ubwo nakuzanira abagusonga waramutse wakomeretse ku maguru. Nibwo yambwiye ati ndagiye, ati ndagaruka mu mwanya, ati nza n'umuntu ukumfasha, ati turebe ukuntu twagukura mu uwo mwobo, ati hanyuma turakujyana tukugeze kuri Sainte Famille, ati niba wumva uri bubashe kugenda, kuko tuguteruye n'ubundi bakutwambura ntabwo twabona uko tuguhisha. Umuntu yaragiye, hashize nk'iminota 30 arongera aragaruka. Amaze kugaruka bazana umugozi, barambwira ngo ninshyire umugozi ngo munsi y'amabere, ngo niba numva hatakomeretse. Umugozi njya kuwushyira munsi y'amabere, nibwo numvise ko akaboko kacitse. Wa muntu arambaza ati nibite? Nti nakaboko kacitse, ndi kumva kashengaguritse. Ati kora no ku maguru wumve. Nkoze ku maguru numva mfite umwenge ku kaguru, hano ku kaguru k'iburyo. Nuko arambwira ati ntacyo, ati niba mu mabere hatakomeretse, ati ntacyo bitwaye, ati ufashe munsi y'amabere turakuzamura buhoro, turakwereka uko tukuzamura uve mu uwo mwobo. Nkoze mu ibere nsanga harimo urukovu, umwenge munini cyane. Maze gufasha umugozi, ati nanjye ndakomeza ngo ukurure, ati ubundi nugera hejuru turagufata. Nyuma baranjyana bangeza kuri Sainte Famille. Sainte Famille niho imodoka za Croix Rouge zankuye zinjyana muri Croix Rouge. Nuko navuye muri Croix Rouge ngera muri Roi Faisal. Ariko ubwo nsubiye inyuma gatoya, navuga ku bibazo by'ubunyamaswa bagiye badukorera, kuntu batufashe ku ngufu batubohoza, ubugome bwinshi bagiye badukorera bwo kudukubita, bwo kutwambura ubusa ku musozi. Ibintu bibi byinshi badukoreye. Ngeweho bankoreye n'ikindi gitangaza, babonaga umuntu wabo wakomeretse kandi wenda akomerekejwe n'igisasu bakaza bakanjyana ngo ninze nywa amaraso y'uwo muntu ngo n'ubundi bwose ni bene wacu bamukomerekeje gutyo. Ubundi kubohozwa bazaga ari 10-15 ntiwamenyaga bakugiyeho, ariko nkanjye ku giti cyanjye abo nzi neza, nzi abantu 6 kandi bamwe baranahari. Muri uko kubohozwa ikibazo twagize cyane ni uburwayi twafashe nyuma y'intambara butangira kugaragara ko umuntu arwaye, umubiri ntuke, ibibazo bikabaho, umuntu akarwaragurika ntakire. Ubundi burwayi bwaje kugaragara n'ubwa sida, aho dutangiriye kubona abo batubohoje batangiye kujya bapfa. Mu buzima busanzwe bw'ubu ngubu mbaho jyenyine, nta mwana ngira, nta mugabo. Mu buzima busanzwe ngewe ubu ngubu ndi ikimuga, murabibona. Ntacyo nagira nakora, nta n'ubushobozi nabona bwo kugikora. Kandi icyifuzo cyanjye mfite nasaba ubu ngubu aho igihe kigeze aha ni ukugira aho mba, kuko nta nzu ngira, aho mba no gukodesha nabwo no guhangayika n'ibibazo. Ngize nk'umugiraneza wantera inkunga yo kubona aho mba, nabwo naba ngize amahirwe.
And now we want to hear about one of the great, really truly horrific early events of April 15th, the Nyarubuye Massacre.
Genocide itangira, Perezida Habyarimana amaze gupfa, bakomeje kutubwira ngo dukomeze kuba mu mago yacu, ngo dukomeza kwibera mu mago yacu nyine nk'uko radiyo yabivugaga. Ariko jye nari ntuye hano hafi nyine hepfo ya paruwasi. Ubwo mu minsi mike hano tubona hatangiye guhungira impunzi nyinshi. Izo mpunzi zaturukaga za Rukira, Kirehe n'utundi turere twinshi duturanye natwo. Ubwo tukaza tukabasura, tukavugana, bakatubwira nyine ko bari guhunga ngo abantu bita interahamwe. None hashize iminsi mike kuri 14 nibwo interahamwe zaje zibanza kurasa hakurya mu ndi mudugudu aho bita Nyarutunga. Ubwo twese twahise tugira ubwoba. Uwo munsi turara mu bigunda, nabwo jye sinaza hano n'umuryango wanjye. Noneho kuri 15 ari wo munsi bateraga hano, nibwo twese twazamutse tuza hano. Turaza twahageze mu masaha y'isaa 4, bahatera isaa 9 z'igicamunsi nyine. Ubwo uwo munsi ntabwo bisha abantu bose ngo babamare, kuko hari hahungiye abantu benshi, nubwo nabatwicaga bari benshi, ariko n'interahamwe zabaga ari nyinshi. Ubwo jyewe ubwanjye twari muri aya mazu turi abantu benshi. Noneho mbere yo kwica abantu, aha ntabwo bari bwahafunge. Hariya hirya winjira kwa padiri harimo urugi. Interahamwe zabanje kuzenguruka zirasa amasasu nyine atugwaho hano. Mwaba muhagaze nk'uko duhagaze, ukabona umwe isasu riramufashe arapfuye. Ubwo twese twahise dutabanyika turirukanka. Noneho tugeze aho ku rugi dusanga interahamwe zahabambiye nyinshi. Nibwo bavugaga ngo umuhutu wabayebeye hano navemo, ntabwo dushaka abahutu, turashaka abatutsi. Ubwo batubwiye gutyo, twumva ko twese tugomba kuvuga ko turi abahutu. Ariko kubera ko abo bantu batwicaga bari abaturanyi, twasangiraga, twashyingiranaga, warabivugaga bikanga bikaba iby'ubusa. Bakavuga ngo uyu munsi ntabwo ari bwo ubaye umuhutu. Ubwo bahise baduhinda nanone, baza batwirukansa n'inkoni n'impiri, inyundo, babaga bafite intwaro nyinshi. Baraza tugera hano, jyewe ubwanjye nageze hariya kubera kugwirirana n'abantu, bahita bankubita umupanga hano kuri uyu musaya. Ngo nahise nikubita hasi. Muri uko kwikubita hasi n'ubwenge bwahise bubura, batwahukamo baradutemagura. Ubwo nari impetse umwana w'imyaka 3, umwana baramutemagura bamwicira mu mugongo. Noneho ubwo byari bimaze kuba nk'aya masaha saa 11, kuko bajyaga kwica batangiraga saa 2, ariko saa 11 yagera bagataha. Ubwo baratashye. Bamaze gutaha, amahirwe nagize icyo gihe cyari igihe cy'imvura nyinshi. Imvura bigeze nimugora nka saa 12 imvura iragwa. Imaze kugwa inyagiye, numva umubiri urikanze, ngaruye makenge. ubwo nagize gutya mbona umwana wanjye yapfuye, mbona abantu twari twazananye umuryango wanjye bose nyine mbona bamwe bapfuye, bamwe nkababona ariko abandi simbabonye kuko twari twahahungiye turi benshi, bamwe babaga baguye impande n'impande. Ubwo nibajije ko nanjye bari bugaruke bakanyica. Muri iyo mvura ngiye guhaguruka birananira, noneho bwije amahirwe uriya musarani murabona uyu muryango ukinguye gutya kuko nari naguye hano imbere yawo. Nakoze uko nshoboye ninjiramo nkambakamba, ndagenda njyamo nicaramo ndaramo. Ku munsi wa kabiri kubera ko bari bahateye nyine ntibica abantu ngo babarangize, barongeye baragaruka saa 2 babaga bahageze, ngumamo sinavamo. Ubwo baraje basozagura babandi bari basize inkomere kuko ntago bose bari bapfuye, uretse ahanini icyo gihe haraye urusaku rw'abana. Abana nibo baraye barira cyane nabi, inkomere batemaguye. Ubwo baraza nyine bahuka muri abo ngabo barabatemagura, bamaze kubasozagura bahita bagenda. Ubwo nagumije guhama muri uwo musarani. Ku munsi nanone wa gatatu none nagumyemo. None icyo gihe baje nyine nabwo baza kureba ko hari abandi baba barimo, ariko icyo gihe nta bari bakirimo. Ahubwo icyo gihe baje n'amamodoka basahura ibintu bya hano kwa padiri byose, utubati n'ibindi bikoresho byose babisahuraga mbareba.
So, just a very quick spreading of the genocide from the capital, where it began with the downing of the president's plane. Very quickly, it spreads from Kigali to the rural areas, and of course, as Unimir is reduced to just this pathetic corps of 250 members or soldiers, it's just absolutely helpless to stop the spread. And the very just lightning fast spread of violence from the capital Kigali to, as this map makes clear, to the hinterland, to the rural, and this, I would just say, kind of speaks to, I think I mentioned this in our first session, how I used to teach this incorrectly until I learned more. I used to kind of equate the Rwandan genocide with state collapse and kind of make the point that, why do we care about state collapse? Well, terrible things happen. Look at Rwanda. But really, that map captures the real nature of the Rwandan state, which is that far from being a collapsed state, it was quite an efficient, in terms of state capacity, quite a strong state. You cannot have, given the physical topography of Rwanda, it's the land of 10,000 hills, you could not effectively orchestrate and see carried out with such frightening efficiency such a massive slaughter of nearly 1 million people in the span of a semester, were it not for the state structures, the command and control that was present among the kind of French-style state, from prefects, sub-prefects, that kind of thing. So what that map shows you, the size of the dots are sizes, or represent the kind of scale of sites of atrocity. And the bigger dots are single instances of where 1,000 or more were killed, and you can see it is a massively efficient killing machine, and the fact that it is mass participation in mass murder, often with very primitive, brutally blunt weapons. The fact that it was so successful in achieving its goals says much about the capacity of the Rwandan state. I think one of the most poignant moments I want us to talk about from the Gorovich is when he observes, and remember, he arrives in Rwanda only months after all this is settled, all the dust is settled, and he's watching, I think in the capital, I don't know where he was, but he just kind of happened upon a butcher doing his thing. He was slaughtering a cow and using a machete, and he saw him hacking away at this cow, right, and realized, what incredible energy had to be expended by the Interahamwe and the people that carried out the genocide. I mean, it was such enormously strenuous work to hack through a human being with a pretty dull machete, and raising the question for him, how do you get people to do that? How do you extract that commitment to expend that kind of physical exertion? And that's, I think, something we should talk about. I think, for me, it's where the indispensable significance of that existential fear that I've talked about is so important. So, as it spread quickly, the Organization of African Unity, which is now called the African Union, largely because of what happens in Rwanda, proposes an intervention force, but it's not got its own capacity. So it proposes to intervene as fast as it can, but needs the material assistance of the outside, namely, the world's hegemon. So it looks to the United States, it looks to President Clinton to provide the material assistance, the military hardware, the Humvees, the Jeeps, that kind of stuff to facilitate an OAU intervention force. But unfortunately, President Clinton does more than drag his feet. And remember the problem that John Roth has with the category of bystander. We do more than bystand. Clinton really does do a great deal to prevent a more effective and timely intervention that could have saved lives, including this belabored process of establishing a leasing agreement for that military equipment, not a loan or simply just giving it to the Organization of African Union to intervene and stop this genocide, but this long discussed, laboriously hammered out leasing agreement, which itself takes a very long time. And the lesson, perhaps one of the most important lessons of Rwanda, is the importance of timely response. That is one of the cardinal principal components of the responsibility to protect that emerges out of all of this. Is, given what we learn here, given how fast it is possible to murder 1 million people, means timeliness is everything, and that's everything that Clinton won't give. So towards the end, by the as a kind of the closure, the RPF has really routed the armed forces of Rwanda and is soon to take Kigali and end this genocide. And as that happens, France again intervenes, ostensibly with a humanitarian mission called Opération Turquoise, which was sold as creating a safe haven. And if any of you students of Bosnia, safe havens are perilously badly named at times, and this is one of those. And really what Opération Turquoise is a cover operation which allows the Hutu extremists to continue with their killing of Tutsis, but also as a way to escape justice, because it is under that turquoise shaded region on the map is the zone that France is authorized by the UN to establish. But it is from that zone, or I should say it is within that zone, that killing continues to be carried out by Hutu extremists. But it is also the way in which so many of them will escape justice, or seek to escape justice, by flooding into Zaire, neighboring Zaire. And that creates problems that are still nightmarishly present for it's now called the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, to this day, because it means that Kagame, realizing that so many 100,000, 200,000, upwards of potentially something like 2 million will exit from Rwanda. Paul Kagame will go hunt them down in Zaire as it becomes Congo, and then he will stick around and use his presence for purposes of extracting conflict minerals in a very criminal way. I should warn you, if you happen to repeat what I've just said in the wrong company, you will face a violent reaction, because that's just not the sort of thing you say about Paul Kagame. He remains a darling of the West. He did, successfully, effectively command the RPF in a way that ended the genocide, and credit is due for that. And as I've said, he's presided over just a simply spectacular economic recovery of Rwanda, but he is absolutely a war criminal today, because of what he has supported in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is the world's worst, most deadly conflict since World War II, and he's a principal reason why it's been that. So Opération Turquoise is the second of France's two really problematic interventions. And we might have time to talk about this in our makeup session. What happens is the Hutu extremists will then use the cover of the refugee camps that are set up in Zaire by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and from those camps continue to carry out their genocidal designs against the Tutsis who have lived in Zaire, Congo, for generations. They go by a different name. They're the Banyamulenge. And the international community, having done nothing during the Rwandan genocide, now starts pouring in just millions and millions of dollars worth of support for the refugee crisis, without realizing what they're doing is actually propping up these génocidaires so they can continue their genocidal campaign in the Congo. As I said, Kagame will send his now called RPA, the Rwandan Patriotic Army, into Zaire, and continues to this day to profit. Part of the economic success story that is Rwanda is due to the theft of just fortunes in conflict minerals from the Congo. Okay, guys, I had hoped to complete this, but it is now 2:15, and I still have to process this this video, so finishing tomorrow.